Every lady at the cattle season dance wanted a turn with Andrew Harding, and every father in Harding's Crossing seemed determined to help her get it. Lanterns hung in a long line from the station eaves to the livery post, and under them the fiddle was still finding its pace. Mr. Turner had already walked his daughter past Andrew twice, once for the punch bowl, and once for no reason at all. None of it moved Andrew much. He nodded to Mr. Turner, complimented the daughter's dress because it seemed the kind thing to do, and kept moving toward the edge of the yard where the lantern light gave out. His father watched from a chair near the station door, arms crossed, satisfied, nodding along to every introduction like each one might finally be the one that took. Abigail Wallace came through the crowd with a tray of coffee cups balanced against her hip, weaving between skirts and boot heels without spilling a drop. She kept her eyes on the tray and her path along the edges. She did not look at the dancers. She did not look at Andrew. He looked at her. It was not her dress, which was plain and gray and nothing like the others. It was that she was the only person in the whole lantern-lit yard who was not trying to be looked at. He crossed toward her before he had decided to and stopped a step short of the tray. "I don't believe we've met," he said. Abigail kept both hands on the tray. "That is likely because I serve supper, sir. I do not attend it." Andrew glanced once toward the tables, then back to her. "Then I've been looking at the wrong side of the table." She did not smile. She shifted the tray a half-inch away from him. "You oughtn't say things like that to kitchen help." She turned before he could answer and carried the tray back toward the boarding house, and Andrew stood where she left him with the fiddle picking up speed behind him and 3 more fathers already circling. He had been chased across that yard by half the eligible daughters in the county, and the only woman who had walked away from him all night was the one carrying the coffee. Harding's Crossing had not always had a yard to dance in. 20 years before, there had been nothing but a rail spur, a water tower, and Simon Harding standing on a raw plank platform, deciding where the freight shed ought to go. He built it with borrowed lumber and paid it off before winter. The boarding house came next, then the feed store, then the livery. When the church wanted land, Simon gave it without being asked twice. He did not do it to be thanked. He did it because he had learned the hard way that a town needed a church in it to feel like more than a row of buildings. Simon's wife died bringing Andrew into the world on a night in early spring when the doctor came too late from the next county over. Simon never remarried. He told anyone who asked that he was too busy building the town to think of it, and most people let that answer stand because it was easier than the truth. The truth was that stillness hurt him and building did not. He kept Andrew mostly on the ranch outside town, rather than raising him only in the rooms above the station office, and he gave the boy over most days to Amos Teal, the foreman who had ridden with Simon since before the rail spur went in. Amos taught Andrew to sit a horse before he taught him to sign his name, to read weather in the color of the western sky, to mend fence in the rain, because fence never waited for good weather to break. By 17, Andrew's hands were rope-scarred and sun-dark, and he could rope a calf clean on the first throw more often than not, and he took more pride in that than in anything his family's name might have handed him for free. He grew up rich, and did not grow up soft. Andrew did not mind the work of a ranch. He minded the work of being looked at like an inheritance with a face on it. "Doesn't make sense," he told Amos once, mending a stretch of wire fence with the old man on a gray afternoon, for a man to marry a woman everyone else picked for him. Amos drove a staple in with 2 clean strikes. "Your pa means well." "I know he does," Andrew said, pulling the wire taut. "If I marry, I aim to be the one doing the asking." The morning after the dance, Andrew found a reason to be at the boarding house before most of the town was awake. The feed order was real enough, though it was not the reason he came so early. He stepped into the kitchen and saw Abigail at the stove, sleeves pushed to her elbows, turning biscuits, checking the coffee, and keeping one eye on the milk cans near the door. Mrs. Colby had a sister married in Liverpool, and after losing 2 kitchen girls in one season, she wrote asking if any steady servant girl wanted passage and work across the Atlantic. Abigail had been raised in an English orphanage and trained early for service, and with no family to keep her there, and enough courage to make the journey, she took the position at Harding House. She scolded a delivery boy for setting the milk cans too near the stove heat, not unkindly, just plain, and the boy grinned at her like he'd been scolded by her before and didn't mind it. She laughed with the other maid over something spilled and quickly wiped away. She spoke warm and easy to Mrs. Colby, the housekeeper who ran the place, asking after her knee, and promised to bring up a hot compress before the day got too far along. Then she saw Andrew standing in the doorway, and the warmth left her face plain and sudden. "Mr. Harding?" She wiped her hands on her apron. "Coffee, or did you come about the order?" "The order," he said, though he'd forgotten what order he meant to ask about. "And coffee, if there's some going." She poured it without meeting his eyes and set it at the end of the table farthest from where she stood. And when he tried to ask how she was settling into the town, she answered with 3 words, and turned back to the stove, sleeves already pushed higher for the next batch of biscuits. He drank the coffee slower than he needed to, watching her work, and left thinking the plain thought a man thinks when a woman won't look at him twice. She simply did not care for him. He tried again 3 days later on the street outside the Mercantile, where he came across her hauling a sack of flour and a parcel of coffee against one hip, the string cutting a line into her palm. The street was busy at that hour, wagons loading. 2 women he recognized from the dance stopped outside the milliner's with their heads together. Andrew reached toward the flour sack before she could shift it again. "Let me carry that." Abigail pulled the flour to her other arm before he could reach it, and her eyes went once quick to the women by the milliner's before coming back to him. "A man in your position ought to be careful what he is seen carrying for a servant." "I offered because it looked heavy," Andrew said, "not because I thought you weak." "It is heavy," she said, "and I am used to it." She walked on and he did not follow because the set of her shoulders told him this was not about the flour at all. He did not understand it yet. He only understood that it was not dislike. His father found him on the station platform 2 evenings later going over a delivery manifest that didn't need going over, and Simon leaned against the freight scale with the look of a man who had been saving up a conversation. "Turner's girl asked after you at church. Feed merchant's daughter too, from what Mrs. Colby tells me. And there's a niece of the Praters visiting from Abilene. Plays piano well enough to make a man forget his manners." Simon said it lightly, but his eyes stayed on Andrew. A man in your position could do worse than to notice one of them noticing him. Andrew set the manifest down on the scale. "You keep finding women for the town, Pa. I'm the one who has to sit across from her at supper for the next 40 years. A man with a town to inherit cannot keep eating alone," Simon said, plain, without heat. Andrew did not answer that. He picked the manifest back up and did not look at it either. That evening, with lamps beginning to show in the windows, Simon circled back to the subject again, this time naming the Prater niece outright, asking would Andrew consider calling on her before she went back to Abilene. Andrew stopped walking. "I thought I found a woman, Pa." Simon turned, brightening at once. "Whose daughter? Turner's girl? The one with the pretty eyes?" Andrew looked toward the boarding house, where a thin line of lamplight showed under the kitchen door. "The new cook at Harding House." Simon went quiet in a way that was not unkind, only stunned. "The cook?" "Yes, sir," Andrew said it steady, a true thing he had decided not to be ashamed of saying out loud. Then, quieter, the steadiness thinning out, "She wanted no part of me. So I'll leave her be." He walked on before his father could answer, boots loud on the packed dirt, and neither of them saw the kitchen door open a crack, or Abigail standing just inside it, with a basket of ash in her hands, gone still enough that the basket did not so much as creak. She had thought his attention was a kindness that would not last. She had not thought until that moment on the dark side of the door that he believed she was the one who had turned him away for good. She stood there long after his footsteps had faded down the street, the ash basket growing heavier in her arms. She found him the next morning by the pump behind the boarding house, working the handle for water he did not need, and she came out with an apron still tied and her hands not yet dry from the washing. "Mr. Harding." She stopped an arm's length from him, closer than she usually allowed. "I was colder than you deserved." He set the bucket down. "I figured I'd misread you." "You hadn't." Abigail looked at the water pooling near his boots rather than at his face. "Where I come from, girls like me learn our place early. A man above us does not court us. If he takes notice, it is rarely a kindness, and it is never lasting. I thought that was what you were doing. Amusing yourself. The kind of amusement that costs a man nothing to lose. I wasn't. I know that now." She wrapped both hands in her apron, twisting the fabric once before letting it go. "I did not know it 3 nights past." Andrew watched her hands settle. "This town is still young, Abigail. Folks here are still deciding what matters." He nodded back toward the freight shed roof visible over the boarding house eaves. "My father built half this place from a platform in a freight shed. I learned my manners on a cattle ranch. I don't see how that makes me too fine to court the woman I choose." She looked at him a long moment, and for the first time since the dance, she let her shoulders drop. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, and there was enough dryness in it that it was almost a joke, though her voice was not quite steady. "Only if I may call you my princess." He said it with no flourish at all, and for the first time she laughed. He came by the kitchen most mornings after that, never staying long enough to be a trouble to her work. One dawn he found her alone with the stove just catching, the parlor still dark and empty around the front of the house. She heard his boots on the step and reached for the good tray out of habit, the polished one kept for guests, before she caught herself and set it back down. "Coffee's in the parlor once it's poured," she said anyway, testing whether he'd take the easier answer. Andrew stopped at the threshold rather than stepping in. "I'd rather have it here." He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, hat still in his hand. "Parlor coffee tastes like people watching." She looked at him a moment, weighing it, then reached instead for the plain kitchen pot and a cup with a chip in the handle, the kind she poured for herself when no one else was up yet. She set it on the flour-dusted work table rather than carrying it anywhere finer and did not apologize for the cup. He came the rest of the way in and drank it standing, elbow braced on the table beside her rolling pin, same as the hired men did before a day's work. He did not glance around the kitchen like a man only tolerating the room he was in. He looked at the bread rising under its cloth at the stove, at her hands working the dough, the way a man looks at anything worth looking at. Mrs. Colby passed through once with an armload of linens, saw the two of them there, and said nothing beyond a good morning to them both before she carried on toward the hall. Abigail noticed that Andrew did not straighten or step back when he was seen. She had watched enough gentlemen find sudden reasons to leave a kitchen once someone caught them in it. He only nodded to Mrs. Colby and went on drinking his coffee. It became a habit neither of them named. He came. She poured. The stove ticked between them while the bread rose, and some mornings that was the whole of it, and it was enough. When he rode out to check fence along the north pasture, she wrapped bread and a wedge of hard cheese in a cloth and set it by the door before he left, much as she might have done for any of the hired men. She was halfway back to the stove before she stopped and looked at it sitting there, and wondered if she had just made herself foolish, offering a rich man's son a parcel like he hadn't a cook of his own 3 times over. She almost went back for it. She left it where it was. Andrew found it on his way out and turned it over once in his hands before he understood it for what it was. Not service, not her trade, but something she had chosen to do, because she wanted to. He brought the cloth back 3 days later, washed, but folded into a shape no launderer had ever intended, corners tucked wrong and one edge rolled instead of creased. Abigail turned it over in her hands at the kitchen door, studying the lopsided corners. "Did you fold this with your hands, Mr. Harding, or a horseshoe?" My hands. He rubbed the back of his neck. The horseshoe may have done better. She laughed then, full and unguarded, bright enough that Mrs. Colby glanced over from the wash line to see what had gotten into the girl. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth as if she could take it back, but it kept coming anyway, and Andrew stood there grinning at the badly folded cloth like it was the finest thing he'd made all week. The Sunday after, church let out to a clear sky, and someone had the notion of a picnic down by the creek bend, wagons and blankets spread under the cottonwoods, children running loose while their mothers unpacked baskets of cold chicken and biscuits. Amos Teal brought his wife in the ranch wagon, and Mrs. Colby gave her blessing easy enough when Andrew asked if Abigail might ride out with them, adding only that she'd expect her back in time to help with Monday's baking. "You've ridden before?" Andrew asked, leading a gentle mare over by the reins once the baskets were emptied. "On a cart horse once, when I was small." Abigail eyed the mare's height. "This looks considerably less patient." "She's the most patient thing on the ranch besides Amos." He held the mare steady while she found the stirrup, close enough to catch her if she slipped, not so close as to crowd her. Hands soft on the reins. "She'll do the rest." She sat the saddle stiff at first, knuckles pale on the horn, flinching when the mare shifted her weight underneath her. Andrew mounted his own horse and rode beside her, close enough to help if the mare sidestepped, but not so close as to crowd her. He told her when to ease her hands and when to hold, and Amos and his wife rode ahead in the wagon within easy sight the whole way, just as Mrs. Colby would have wanted. By the time they climbed the rise above the creek, Abigail had eased into the mare's walk, shoulders dropping, hands finding a lighter hold on the reins. They stopped their horses on the ridge and looked down at the town and the ranch spread beyond it, rooftop small, church bells silent in the distance. "You look different out here," Abigail said, watching him settle easy in the saddle, reins loose in one hand. "Better or worse?" She looked down toward the station roof and the boarding house chimney where she'd spent so many mornings behind a door. "Less owned." Andrew loosened the reins a little further and looked at the color the ride had put in her face. "So do you." "Better or worse?" Her hand eased on the saddle horn. "Better." Andrew smiled only a little. "Less afraid." Neither of them said anything more for a while, and the wind moved through the grass, and it did not need saying more than that. Word travels faster in a small town than any writer can outpace it, and by the second week, Simon had heard enough of it from enough different mouths, Mrs. Colby's careful mentions, a comment dropped by the banker's wife at the feed store, his own eyes catching Andrew's horse tied outside the boarding house more mornings than not, that he sought his son out at the corral one evening, leaning on the top rail with his hat pushed back. "They're talking in town," Simon said, "about you and the Wallace girl." "Let them talk. It isn't that simple, son." Simon turned his hat brim in his hands. "People will say things to her that they'd never say to your face. A wife in our position has to stand in front of this whole town for the rest of her life. I'm not saying she can't. I'm asking if you've thought what it costs her, if she can't." Andrew held his father's eyes. "Then I'll stand close enough that they have to say it to me, too." Simon did not answer that right away. He only turned his hat over once more in his hands and let the silence do the rest. Founder's Day came at the end of the month. The whole town turned out around the station yard again, lanterns strung, tables of food laid. Father circled same as always, and this time the Prater niece had come back from Abilene, especially for the evening, dressed sharp enough that half the yard noticed, her mother steering her toward whatever spot in the crowd Andrew happened to be standing. Abigail worked the early part of the supper, carrying trays and refilling the coffee urns, while the fiddle player tuned up near the platform steps, then slipped away to change out of her apron into the one clean dress she owned, plain gray wool with a collar she'd pressed herself that morning. She came back to the edge of the hall to watch rather than serve, since Mrs. Colby had told her to take the evening for herself. She had barely found a spot near the end of the food table when she heard two of the town women talking low near the lantern post, not troubling to lower their voices as much as they thought they had. "Surely Mr. Harding's first dance is spoken for," one of them said, glancing toward the Prater girl. "Some girls," the other answered with a small smile aimed nowhere in particular, "ought to remember which side of the supper table they belong on." Abigail did not answer them. She had heard worse said plainer back home by people who meant it crueler. She only folded her hands and told herself she had not come for a dance. She had come to watch him have his, and that would be enough, she told herself again, though her eyes kept finding him across the yard, whether she meant them to or not. Across the crowd, Andrew caught the tail end of it too. Not the words, but the way the two women glanced toward Abigail, and then away, the way Abigail's chin came up a fraction higher after. He did not cross to confront them. He only watched Abigail a moment longer than he meant to, his jaw setting harder than it had been a minute before. The fiddle started up, first notes finding their pace the way they always did, and every eligible daughter in the yard straightened where she stood, waiting for Andrew to cross toward one of them, the way the whole evening had been arranged for him to do. The Prater girl smoothed her skirt. Mr. Turner's daughter took half a step forward, ready. He did not go to either of them. Andrew crossed the yard while the fiddle was still finding its rhythm, past the Prater niece, past Mr. Turner's daughter, past his own father standing near the station door with his hat in his hands. Somewhere behind him, he heard the Prater girl's mother draw a sharp breath and saw from the corner of his eye her hand close hard on her daughter's arm as if to stop her from following him with her eyes. He stopped in front of Abigail and held out his hand where every soul in that lantern light could see it plain. "Miss Wallace, if your work is done, I'd be honored to have the first dance." Abigail looked past him at the women in their clean, bright dresses, then down at her own plain gray sleeves, and did not move. Her fingers tightened on the fold of her skirt. Accepting meant something could not be unmeant afterward in front of this many witnesses, and she understood that as surely as she understood anything. Andrew lowered his voice so it carried to her alone. "Only if you choose it." She looked at his hand a moment longer, then at his face, steady and waiting without pressing. Then she set her own hand into it. The whole yard went quiet enough to hear the fiddle catch its stride. Andrew led her out onto the open ground at the center of the hall, and for the first turn, neither of them spoke at all, his hand at her waist, hers light on his shoulder, like she wasn't yet sure she was allowed to be there. The lantern swung a little overhead in the evening air. Somewhere past his shoulder she could see the whole yard watching, her father gone still, the Prater girl's face gone carefully blank, Simon near the door with his hat in his hands. She had learned to carry trays through crowded rooms with her eyes down and her steps quiet. Now the whole yard was watching, and Abigail did not lower her eyes. Andrew Harding led Abigail through the first dance of the evening, and no one in Harding's Crossing could pretend not to understand it. Simon watched from the station door, his hat still in his hands, jaw tight at first. Then he saw his son's face, easy and certain in a way he had not seen it through all the evenings of proper introductions. And he saw Abigail holding herself through the dance, chin level, back straight, like a woman who had decided she would not be hidden from tonight forward. He did not say anything to anyone. He only watched, and by the time the fiddle finished its first turn, his shoulders had dropped, and his hat had come to rest against his chest. Simon found Abigail near the end of the food table, after the music had moved on to other couples. He stood a moment before he crossed to her, turning his hat over once in his hands. Then he came without the hat at all, which she would later understand was his way of showing he'd come to speak plain. "You know what people will say," he said. "Yes, sir." Abigail kept her hands folded in front of her, steady. "I learned early that people say plenty when they think you cannot answer them." Simon studied her face a moment, no eagerness in it for the name she might carry, if anything, something closer to weariness of it. It was not what he had expected to find. "My son thinks a great deal of you," he said. "I think a great deal of him too, sir." "I did not expect to." Simon nodded slowly, and for the first time since the dance began, he smiled, small and real. "No," he said. "I don't suppose either of us expected a good many things this year." He glanced back toward the dance floor where Andrew stood waiting near the edge of the crowd, watching them both. "He gets that stubbornness from his mother, if you're wondering. I only ever gave him the ranch." Andrew brought her out to the ranch the following Sunday, the wagon rattling over ruts she'd never had reason to travel before. Amos Teal was mending tack by the corral when they rode in, and he looked up just long enough to nod at Abigail before bending back to his work, though his eyes stayed on the pair of them a good deal longer than the tack required. Andrew helped her down and walked her up to the porch of the house, where he had grown into a man under another man's patient teaching, past a rail worn smooth by 20 years of boots, past a door that stuck a little in damp weather, and always had. He did not sit her in the parlor. He brought her through to the kitchen where the table sat worn and pine and scarred with years of use, nothing like the polished furniture in the boarding-house parlor she'd spent so many mornings serving coffee beside. He stood at the head of it and turned his hat in his hands the way his father's had been turned that night at the corral. "I don't want you on the far side of my table, Abigail." He set his hat down on the worn pine. "I want you at the head of it." Abigail ran her fingers along a scar in the wood, worn smooth by years of meals before hers, and did not trust her voice right away. She understood, standing in that kitchen and not the parlor, exactly what he was choosing to show her, his real life, not his family's good furniture. "I didn't come looking for a cook," Andrew said. "I came looking for the woman I kept seeing after the room emptied out." "Is this where I call you my lord?" Abigail asked, and her voice caught somewhere between a laugh and something closer to tears. "Only if I may call you my princess," Andrew said, "after you say yes." She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. And he crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his. And outside the window, Amos Teal finally stopped pretending he wasn't watching, and grinned wide enough to be seen clear across the yard, then turned back to his tack with a whistle that carried all the way to the house. But Abigail did not learn her new place at the altar. She learned it at the table, one supper at a time. They married in the fall in the church Simon had given the land for, with the whole town crowded into pews that had once been raised by neighbors helping neighbors get a start. Mrs. Colby sat near the front with a handkerchief she didn't try very hard to hide, and the same women who had once whispered by the lantern post at Founder's Day sat with the rest of the congregation and sang the hymns along with everyone else. Simon stood at the front with his son and did not try to hide that his eyes were wet through most of it. And when the preacher asked if any objected, the church stayed silent in a way it would not have stayed silent a year before. Abigail wore a plain dress, pressed white cotton with no lace to speak of, and carried a small bunch of wildflowers Amos Teal's wife had cut from the ranch that morning. When Andrew took her hand at the altar, his own was shaking slightly, and she squeezed it once, steady, the way she used to steady a tray crossing a crowded room. Afterward, on the church steps, Simon took Abigail's hands in both of his, the same way his son had at the kitchen table, and gave his blessing loud enough for the whole gathered town to hear it. They took up the ranch house together after that, the one Andrew had grown up in, and Amos moved into the small cabin Andrew built him near the north pasture, close enough to still ride out with them most mornings, close enough to still call the shots on branding day, like he'd never given up the job at all. Abigail set the ranch table herself that first week as its mistress rather than its help. And when Andrew pulled her chair out for her at supper, plain as anything, she sat down at the head of it, and did not once look toward the kitchen door the way she used to. Amos took his meals with them most evenings still, same as he always had, and the first time he caught himself calling her Mrs. Harding, ma'am, instead of just Abigail, she laughed and told him plain never to start that nonsense now. The first year wore them both down, honest. There was drought one season and too much rain the next. Fence to mend and hands to feed and a roof that leaked over the north room until Andrew finally got up and fixed it himself rather than pay a man to do it. One evening that first autumn, with Amos and two of the hired hands at the table, and the plates just cleared of stew, Abigail rose out of old habit to start gathering dishes before anyone had finished talking. Andrew caught her hand before she'd taken more than a step, and drew her gently back down into her chair. He did not make a show of it in front of the men. He only turned the bread plate toward her, as if she had never been meant to leave the table at all. Amos glanced toward the empty chair beside Abigail, then back at Andrew. "We'll need another hand before frost if the north fence keeps giving us trouble." Andrew nodded, but his eyes stayed on Abigail a moment longer. "I was thinking the same, but I wanted Abigail here before we settled it." The talk stopped around the table. Abigail looked at the men around the table, waiting without impatience, and then at Andrew's hand, still resting near hers. Amos cleared his throat and reached for his coffee. "Well, then," he said, as if this had always been the order of things, "now that Mrs. Harding's sitting, we can talk business proper." The hired hands bent back over their plates. Andrew went on discussing fence wire and winter feed with Amos, but Abigail stayed where she was, hands folded in her lap, listening. She did not speak much that evening. She did not need to. By the time the lamp burned low, she understood what Andrew had done. He had not asked her to earn her chair. He had simply refused to let the table go on without her. The children came after that, 3 of them over the years that followed, and the ranch house that had once held only a widower and a boy, and an old foreman's quiet company, filled up with boots by the door and noise at the table, and small feet running the porch boards loose. Amos Teal taught the eldest to sit a horse patient as ever, and swore up and down to anyone who'd listen that the boy had his grandfather's stubborn streak in him already. Abigail kept the kitchen busier than it had ever been in her own working days, but no one who watched her move through it now would have called her a servant in it. She set bread to rise while the children argued over chores. And when the youngest tugged at her apron, wanting to help, she pulled a stool over and let small hands press the dough just as she'd once been taught in a kitchen an ocean away. Simon visited more than he ever let on he meant to. He would ride out on some flimsy excuse about the herd count or the fence line, and Abigail would set an extra place at the table without being asked. One evening he'd barely settled into his chair on the porch before the youngest came barreling out the door in her nightgown, refusing to be put to bed until she'd said good night to her grandfather, and climbed straight up into his lap without waiting to be invited. Simon made a show of grumbling about it, but his arm came around her easy enough, and by the time Abigail came out to fetch her, the child was already asleep against his shoulder, thumb near her mouth, and Simon was looking out over the same land he'd once looked at from a bare station platform with nothing on it but a plan and some borrowed lumber. "I spent years building rooms," he told Abigail, not moving so as not to wake the girl, watching the older children chase fireflies down toward the creek as the light faded. "Took me long enough to learn they needed voices in them." Abigail sat beside him on the porch step, and did not say anything to that, because there was nothing worth adding to it. Simon grew old slowly and without much complaint, content now to sit the porch rail rather than ride the fence line. He lived to see the town keep growing around the station he'd built from nothing, to see his son's name spoken of kindly by the same fathers who had once tried so hard to arrange a different match for him. He took to carrying peppermints in his coat pocket for whichever grandchild caught him first coming through the door, and pretended each time that he'd forgotten he had them. In his last spring, with the grandchildren grown loud enough to fill the whole house, and Andrew's herd doubled from what it had been, Simon sat with Abigail on the porch one evening, while the others were down at the barn, and took her hand the way he had that day on the church steps. "You made a home of what I only built," he said. He died that summer, peaceful, in his sleep, in the room above the station office where he had lived out most of his years. The whole town turned out for the burying, not because Simon had owned so much of it, but because he had given so much of himself to it. Andrew and Abigail renovated the old station the following spring, new boards over the old platform, fresh paint on the shed Simon had once built with borrowed lumber and paid off before winter. It was the same platform he'd stood on deciding where the freight shed ought to go. When the new sign went up over the door, 2 hired men on ladders, ropes creaking as the letters swung into place, it read Simon Harding Station in letters big enough to see from the road. The whole town gathered for it, fathers and daughters and merchants, all of them standing together in a yard that had seen weddings and dances and a lifetime of Founders' Days. The church bell rang out over the crowd while Abigail stood on the platform with Andrew beside her and their children weaving between the grown-ups' legs. Then the afternoon train sighed to a stop and new arrivals began stepping down. Abigail noticed her before anyone else did. A young woman stepping down off the last car, English by her accent when she asked the conductor which way to the boarding house, a trunk too heavy for her arms and no one waiting to meet her. The girl set the trunk down and looked at it a moment, shoulders already dropping the way Abigail's once had. Abigail crossed the platform and took the other handle before the girl could think to refuse or apologize for the trouble. "This way," she said. "It isn't far." She did not let go of the trunk until they'd reached the boarding house door. Abigail had crossed an ocean once, believing she knew her place. Harding's crossing gave her a better one, beside Andrew, at the table they filled in the town his father had raised from dust.